afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Educational Leadership Community School Research Practice Network webinar series. My name is Emily Chen, the data researcher at the Institute for Educational Leadership. This is a part of our ongoing webinar series to build field capacity and to share across different ideas, policy, and practice that can impact in the forum of community school work. So before we start, we wanted to remind you we have web links shared here. So when you go to our community school RPN webpage, you can access to our previous webinar recording. And in the middle, we have one polling questions. If you haven't answered that question yet, so please do it right now. And in the chat box, please type any questions you have during the presentation and the question between the speaker and the moderator today. We will answer them. And I will hand my microphone to our moderator today, Jose Munil, the Vice President for the Equity and Impact at Institute for Educational Leadership.
Thank you, Emily. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you on the call right here, and welcome to Coordinator Appreciation Week. It's fitting with the conversation we have going on today about the return of investment. And with me today, I have my good friend, Michelle Bloodworth. I'll talk a little bit more about her. But another hat that I wear on top of the Vice President of Equity and Community Impact here at IEL is I'm also the Director for the Coalition for Community Schools. And most of you, almost all of you on the call are already familiar with community schools. But just to get you a little bit more familiar with the coalition itself, it is an alliance of local, state, and national partners across our country and internationally who really use community schools as an equity strategy to achieve education and economic equality. So we hope to that we can add value to you today and talk about this study. But a little bit about the study before I introduce Michelle itself. So most of you know I came from the local community over in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And while there, I was extremely fortunate to work with a group of elected officials and community members who designed a system that lasted past any type of leadership. We've gone through 4 superintendents. We've gone, new mayors have been elected, county commissioners have been elected, city councilors have been elected, school board members were elected, community members changed positions, and yet the system sustained. The hard part that we had in our community school development was actually finding funding or even changing our own funding, their own funding, the organization I've listed, to actually provide resources to hire a person who did pretty much community organizing work. So here we were faced with a complex issues in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and that families were facing. And so we needed complex solutions, but we needed to rely on that person, the community school coordinator. Community schools that are learning is more about community development than it is the right type of model. So we needed the right type of person. So we ventured out and to encourage ourselves and to work within our own institutions and other funders to find out if we are funding this position that we now have a handful of community school coordinators, what is the actual return of investment? We did see things like graduation rates increase. We did see things like math and reading scores get better. We did see things like attendance and enrollment on the upswing. We did see things as far as families wanting to stay in their local community and reducing student mobility. We saw all those things, but yet still had a hard time of funding a community school coordinator. Most of the questions led to, what is the coordinator actually doing to change that? Because most people put it on the value of just the program, and programs were very valuable in this process. But it was the facilitation, the relationship building, the resource coordination that this magical person, this builder of a community was doing. And so we decided to let's let's see exactly what that value is. Let's find out how much the coordination from this single person, this community school coordinator, what is the value of that back to local school? So we reached out to Apex Education, who Michelle Bloodworth used to work for, and now she has her own business. And they began the process of a return of investment of a community school coordinator. Without further ado, I want to introduce Michelle. So Michelle's a good friend of mine. We were just talking and just figured out that we've known each other since 2008 now. And so she's a good, dear friend and get a chance to hang out with us too. So now she's the owner and the CEO of her own company. They're called Insights Allies, but she has been engaged in evaluations across multiple sectors, education, health, and community spectrum. And in education, that even varied from early childhood to higher education. Michelle, she also has some experience planning and conducting large and small scale evaluations, both locally and nationally. And she's also gave some consulting. She actually trained our staff in Albuquerque on results-based accountability while we were there as well too. But now Michelle, she has her master's in clinical psychology, but she also has a doctorate in community and prevention research and has used that experience as leading as president of the New Mexico Evaluator. I know you guys can't clap, but I'll clap for you. I want to welcome everybody. Michelle Bloodworth.
Thank you, Jose.
Thank you, Michelle. And so Michelle's going to give us a little rundown of what the actual return of investment evaluation looks like. We're going to follow that with some questions if questions that I'll be listening will have with Michelle. But please also use the chat box for any questions that you may have with Michelle during our regular Q&A. So Michelle, you want to take it away? You want to?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jose. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here this afternoon and to share the results from the ROI study with you. So ROI originates in the finance and business worlds and is used to evaluate the efficiency of an investment. It's a pretty simple process. To calculate an ROI, you take the benefit or return of an investment and you divide it by the cost. But ROIs have also increasingly been used outside of those contexts of finance and business. And in this particular situation, the ROI approach was applied in a novel way. And as Jose said, that it was to assess the benefit of a community school in investing in a coordinator compared to the cost. So in other words, this study answers the question, for every dollar invested in having a coordinator at a community school, what is the value or benefit the school receives in return? So that's what we sought out to answer. So this study is a case study. That means that it's focused deeply on one school and one coordinator. That school of focus was Manzano Mesa Elementary School and their coordinator from the period of 2011 to 2016. So a really good question to start with was why one coordinator, why one school? Those of you who know Jose, like I do, will not be surprised that once he hatched the idea of a potential study like this, that waiting years to collect additional data was not, did not seem very appealing. And so we decided to look to where could we start where there was data, and because we definitely wanted to start somewhere. And so that's why we decided to start at Manzano Mesa with the coordinator who was there during that time period. So because even as a brand new coordinator in a brand new community school, Deanna, the coordinator of Focus, she kept lots and lots of data, and so that's where we decided to begin. So to our knowledge, an ROI of a community school coordinator had not previously been done. And so the first thing we had to do was build on and extend existing ROI approaches. And so we took other approaches that included social return on investment approaches and approaches that business worlds use around training, but there really wasn't anything that exactly looked like studying a particular role. So we took these other approaches and we developed an approach of our own, which is listed here as the broad steps, and I'm going to walk through those in a little bit more detail. So the first broad step that we needed to take was determining what to measure. And we began with measuring, with deciding to engage stakeholders to try to understand that more. And so the very first thing we did was this wonderful event at the school where we shared dinner and hosted focused dialogues with each of these groups listed here to learn from their perspectives on the role of a coordinator in a community school. So we had parents from that school, we had coordinators from the entire Albuquerque area, we had partners, teachers, other principals, as well as systems leaders. And each of those groups of people went and had a focused conversation about the role of a community school coordinator, and we learned a lot. Another place that we learned from and that really supported us through this work was around the advisory committee, was using an advisory committee. So we engaged stakeholders, and these stakeholders were researchers, other community school coordinators, school administrators, business folks, and we brought this group together several times, and they gave invaluable input at important stages along the process as we would develop the approach we were going to take and to bring this group together to be able to have them advise us as we went through. So there was another tool that we used. So while we learned a lot about the coordinator at that kickoff event, we also utilized an existing tool, and this was a tool that ABC had developed called the Community School Coordinator Stages of Development, which was based off the coalition's site standards, but took those site standards and laid them out as a continuum about what it looks like in multiple different areas of contribution of how a coordinator works within a school. And that was really useful to us and created a framework through which we could go forward. So I'm going to show you, these are the broad categories from that tool, the Community School Coordinator Stages of Development tool. And so you see that there's everything from collaborative leadership and planning to powerful learning, and these are the broad areas in which a community school coordinator engages at the school. And this created a framework that allowed us to collect data and to check in with partners and others as we went forward in the study. So an important step in the process was identifying boundaries. Basically, this was a step where we had to define what to include and what not to include. So one category of benefits that we were not going to include were intangibles. And these are the benefits that are just not feasible to monetize. And some examples are here, such as like increased family engagement or increased staff understanding of the community school strategy, positive media coverage. All of these kinds of things are intangibles, and we learned about them through the process, but they weren't things that we monetized or included in our ROI calculation. There's a couple additional boundaries that I want to mention, and they were established in the study. The first was that we would focus on the value of impact on the students, families, and staff. I'm sorry, let me state that over again. That since this was an ROI study and not an SROI or a social return on investment, that we were not going to be including the value of the impact on the students, families, and staff. And so that's one big important boundary that we had to establish. As Jose mentioned earlier, we knew of these impacts that were happening, but the question for this particular study was really focused on that what could be monetized that directly related to resources, benefits that the coordinator was able to bring in and leverage within the school. So relatedly, we also quickly saw that benefits of a coordinator have the potential to cause a significant ripple effect in the community. So for example, a program that facilitates parents operating a preschool co-op contributes to the school and the success of those children who are part of the co-op, but it clearly is easy to see how those parents who are involved also develop job skills, and there's a clear possibility of economic impact on those families in the community. But we had to draw a line or a boundary around what to include and what not to include. So given the potential for these ripple effects and the realities that we only had retrospective data to work with, we established a boundary that would help us be consistent and clearly define what benefits and costs to include and what not to include. So we decided to define the boundary of the study as the school of focus itself and not include any benefits that were realized by other schools or the community as a whole. So that was a really important step in defining what would be there and what wouldn't be there. So, but it's important I'll just mention here that it's clear that along the way we really made conservative choices, that when there were different decision points about whether to include something or not include it, we really tried to err on the side of being conservative so that there could be confidence in the resulting ROI that we calculated. So the next broad step that we were involved in was gathering and organizing the data. Now there was a lot of data, so this was a pretty time-consuming step. My co-author, Anna Horner, and I spent many hours with Deanna, the coordinator, going through literally boxes and boxes of paper that contained the data. And so this was a pretty big step in order to figure out what we had and to organize it and catalog it and understand what we'd be able to work with. Part of this process was establishing the types of costs and benefits to include in the study, and they're listed here. So for cost, it was clearly the coordinator's salary, benefits paid to the coordinator, cost of professional development, and stipends. So sometimes a partner organization comes in and wants to implement a program in the school, and this is going to, and in order to facilitate that happening, they might provide a stipend to the coordinator to pay extra compensation for the time that might involve. On the other side, benefits-wise, those benefits that we included were grant dollars, the value of volunteer hours, professional time for people who are coming into the school, programs and services provided in kind, materials, supplies, and other physical donations. So those are the broad categories of benefits that were included. So this table shows the cost, and these are all the costs we totaled for the 5-year period. The table lays out that the year that the costs were incurred, the type of cost, whether it was salary or professional development, the type of source, the funding source that those funds came from, as well as the amounts. And so you can see that over the 5-year period, the total came to just under $150,000. So the last main step that we had was actually calculating the ROI. And for determining the financial value of benefits, we use resources such as like the the Bureau of Labor Statistics for calculating the value of volunteer time, for instance. So one important step that we needed to undertake was isolating the effects. And this step is what takes into consideration that inherent in a community school strategy is it's a very collaborative approach where the coordinator is clearly not working alone, but is actually working with many others to implement the strategy. Thus, we had to figure out how to isolate the effects of the coordinator. To gather background information, we asked Deanna 4 questions, and then before we could proceed with the next step. So these questions included, did this exist before you came to the school? Describe the role you played in making this happen. Who else contributed to this happening? And who else would be able to provide insider information into how this was able to happen in the school? Based on that information, we established 2 broad categories of benefits. Category 1 was clearly where 100% of the benefit for that particular program or resource or donation was attributed to the coordinator. The other category included everything else. So for that category 2, which included everything that couldn't be 100% attributed to Deanna, we went about doing interviews with key stakeholders to get their perspective on how this benefit came to be and came to be used. And that was an important step for us to understand what the process looked like. And we utilized that stages of development tool to help us in those interviews. And then we took that to a committee in order to have them review our work and give and reach consensus about any place that there was disagreement. And once all of that was finished, we were able to take those, what we called isolation percentages, and apply those. So let me show you what that looked like. On this table, there's a sample. This is a sample table from the data pages. And for your fun, in the full report, which we'll be sharing how to access that, there's 11 pages of these data tables that you can peruse in your leisure time. But the table shows how the various components came together. The category of benefit, the type of benefit that it was, the partner, funding source. If you move towards the right of the table, you'll see that we begin with a total value, and then based on all the process I just laid out, we had a percentage of attribution, and we multiplied the total value by that percentage of attribution to arrive at the isolated value. Those final values were what went into the ROI calculation. So we come to the final stages of the process, and this is where all these steps were complete. And what we look at is that when you take the total benefit minus the program cost, you get the net benefit. And dividing that by the program cost, that you arrive at the ROI. So in this case, we see that for this study, we found an ROI of 711%. This means that each dollar invested in the coordinator returns approximately $7.11 in net benefits. Now this table shows the breakdown of the ROI by year, because the study did include a 5-year period. And you can see that the ROI varied quite a bit by year, which I believe is probably going to be a common finding as we go forward, that there's just a lot of variability by year depending on the programs and resources and partners that a community school is engaging. So I want to touch a little bit on the limitations of the study. Obviously, one important limitation is that this was one coordinator in one school. So this case study definitely has limitations around generalizability. For instance, experienced coordinators or those with personal characteristics especially suited to the role may have better results than a coordinator with less experience. I mean, in this particular case, while the coordinator was brand new, she clearly, most people would attest, had innate personal characteristics that allowed her to develop quickly into the role. The experience and capabilities of each coordinator are going to vary naturally. And with awareness of these limitations, this study was always seen as a pilot study and a place to begin, but with every intention of performing more ROIs in other schools and with other coordinators in the future. The other thing I'll mention is that it was retrospective. And so we had, while the coordinator that we focused on had lots of data, there were limitations. It was not known when this data was collected that there would be a future study, and some of the data that we had available was incomplete. But we certainly had quite a bit of data. So I'll mention, as I mentioned before about the boundaries, where we did not include the impact of the actual benefits on students or on families, we do point out in the report several examples of that impact. While it's not included in the calculation of the ROI, we thought it was important in order to tell the whole story. So one such example of impact is the Community Academic Mentoring Program. The creation of this program was largely dependent on the coordinator, and during its first 2 years, for which this data here on the slide represents, there were 123 volunteers serving 46 students. And those students achieved more reading level gains on average than a comparison group. So that's the extent of our study the parts that I wanted to share, and I'm glad to be able to do so.
No, thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate that, man. You bring back some memories right there. I do want to address one question that came up real quick: the cost of the coordinator. You know, you talked about that. It was one of those slides back there. I could find that slide. I want to talk about that real quick before I go into some general questions for you. Mm-hmm. Please feel free to add any more questions. I'll kind of stop at this slide right here. But yeah, that was one of the challenges. That's one of the purposes of the study, was that it was hard to move people towards funding a position, and a position that's very complex to describe. So we need to put a value on that for some folks outside of that. So Deanna, if I could brag about Deanna real quick. So Deanna now works as the community school manager who is training other coordinators with the ABC Community School Partnership back in Albuquerque. But Deanna, before she was a coordinator, was one of those moms that were always volunteering at the school. So when this opportunity came up as the school was exploring community schools, she was asked, would you mind doing this type of work? And at that point, there's only enough funding for a part-time position, in which we all know that folks who move into this space as a community school coordinator really work from their heart. And so Deanna always put in full-time work and effort as much as she could while still providing for her family. So her work and some of the results of her work led to her the advocacy of more full-time. Mm-hmm. And this study came at a time where we were in the process of how do we scale this now across an entire district and across the community upon existing funding. Now, those who don't know New Mexico, there's not a corporate office in the whole state, and rarely is there large foundational money that comes through, although we're very appreciative of the Kellogg Foundation and its early investment in community schools. So, well, I got a couple more questions, Michelle. So I've been in this role now for 2 years, so I had to dust off some cobwebs, and thanks for doing that for me. You talk a lot about the boundaries. If I go back to the boundaries part of the conversation, go to our slide. The boundaries part of our conversation is like, what? Could you kind of elaborate a little bit more why we needed to set boundaries? I remember that early on.
Yeah, that we realized from the beginning that, one, this was a brand new application of ROI, and that we wanted to be prepared for people who might push back and say, well, how do we have confidence that this is real? Like how, so we were aware that if we took a liberal approach and included everything that came our way as far as possible benefits from the coordinator, that people could easily push back on our findings, to be able to question and to actually say that it was maybe inflated. So that we really, all along the way, we had to make decisions, and we had this in our mind from the very beginning, that we needed to take a conservative approach, that we wanted to only include things within the study that we were confident were clearly due to the coordinator being in their role. And so that was why we had to have these boundaries, because otherwise it just, we had to have something that helped us to make decisions along the way about what data to go out and seek, what to include, what to ask about in those interviews I mentioned. And so that was kind of an important part of us establishing how to do the study, were those boundaries.
Yeah, one of the questions that came up from Angelina is just assuming the community school coordinator was the only community school staff. Mm-hmm. So part of this too, when we're doing this study, the coordinator is the key role of a community school. We all know that, but we thought about sustainability back then from the get-go. So it was a model or a practice that was developed from, we're going to rely on community strengths to staff any type of programmatic need. And so this value, this ROI, of Deanna's work at Manzano Mesa is a true testimony of the power of community when a strong coordinator could mobilize the relationships and resources for a targeted effort. Does that sound about right?
It does sound about right. And we had examples in the study of partners who did happen to be at the school prior to it becoming a community school or prior to Deanna coming on as a coordinator, as well as partners who really were able to be engaged because there was a coordinator in place. And both of those two groups, the types of partners who were there already and the partners who were new, both spoke about how different of an environment it was to be able to come into a school where you had this person in the role of a coordinator. But there really wasn't others that we really relied on, or the school and the approach really relied on these partners bringing in the programming, the staffing, to carry out the programs. And the coordinator was really there to help integrate and make sure that it was in line with the mission of the school and the school's focus, as well as to be able to connect and coordinate all these various partners and programs.
So talk about that some.
Yeah.
So these various partners and programs, because a lot of times people who don't know community schools see community schools as solely wraparound services. You know, from your depth of looking through all that paperwork and engaging these different partners,
Mm-hmm.
what were some of the various levels that Deanna had to actually navigate her conversation and people?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really important things that was a real strength at Manzano Mesa, the School of Focus, was the establishment that, and Deanna, the coordinator, helped to put this in place, was this community school council. And so you had this group of people who represented staff from the school, such as teachers, as well as parents, partners, school administration, and they made a lot of the decisions and actually did a lot of the work. And the coordinator's role was bringing them data, bringing them relevant data to help them to make decisions. And they would then, you know, I think the more data savvy they got, the more they wanted, you know, data. And then that was part of the coordinator's role, was going out and facilitating that. But she was navigating that council and really having that broad stakeholder representation guiding things.
Who are some of those partners? You mentioned partners in general, but like who are some of the organizations that made up the partnerships that you saw?
Yeah, so there's an organization that does arts programming, and they were coming into the school to do during the school day and after school day, doing art programming, as well as after school provider, you know, Children's Choice. So they were there in the school, and they were one of the partners who was there before the school actually became a community school, and they were there providing fee for service after school, and their work expanded greatly, largely due to their experience in this particular school as it became a community school.
Didn't they, so now you're triggering some memories here, but through that facilitation, that data-oriented facilitation and desire to change their own practices, if I remember correctly, Children's Choice, Choice, they actually, with that fee-based structure, changed some of that fee-based structure to achieve some equity, but they actually started doing that in all the other schools across the district.
They did, and that's a perfect example of where...
That added to the ROI.
Yes, no, it did. And they really was an example of leveraging funds so that in the end, you know, as a partner, it met their needs and their mission, but they were certainly able to serve more children as they partnered with others and had a more integrative approach. But that, you know, it's important to tie back what you were just mentioning. So that their experience in this school, Manzano Mesa, had a ripple effect across the community, because they took what they learned and they took it elsewhere. But that's an example of where we had to bound this particular study. That's an example of that boundary. Because while we could have, I'm sure there's a monetary, it could have been monetized what that ripple effect was, but that wasn't included for this study. Yeah.
So, I mean, the changes of practice is one thing. The different partners, New Mexico PBS, University of New Mexico, Asian Children and Family Association of New Mexico. So one, my godmother, the godmother of community schools, Jane Quinn, how you doing? Just has a question. What other things accounted for the variation in the ROI by year?
Well, that in this particular school, there was a large grant that came in during one particular period, and that really helped to provide resources to establish a lot of things that were sustained after that. And so that's one example of where you see in the year 3 the increase in the funding spike at that point. And then, so that's one example of the variation. And then other programs would come, for instance, one of the best things that Albuquerque does have are the national labs. And so we have Sandia labs there. And actually, this particular school has a fair number of parents who work at the labs, and those individuals would come in to provide, you would have a volunteer in the school, but that volunteer was a nuclear physicist, for instance, teaching students in the school about STEM and encouraging them in that area. So it was quite a bit. I mean, as I mentioned, there's 11 pages of all of this data, and so there's a lot of it. It shifted from year to year, what kinds of benefits were coming into the school and how things came in and other things would expire or end.
Okay. Now, I have one more question. I'm going to go back.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep going back and forth. You talked about limitations.
Mm-hmm.
One of the limitations you put on there was that this is about one coordinator, one point of time.
Yes.
Here. Now, Michelle, yes, I could definitely see that. Now, what people don't know about Michelle, she's been working in the community school space for about 15 years in a couple of places at least, maybe more.
Chicago. Yeah, was an important where I got my, my training, my first experiences.
And what was your experience in Chicago again?
So I was part of the evaluation team when Chicago ramped up to create 100 community schools within 3 years. So I was part of a team that was studying those 100 community schools and got to go and visit most of those schools and learn about each one being unique, but learned about what the coordinator's role looked like in a lot of those schools.
And then through this study, you learned more about what that role looks like. So would you say are there certain functions from your experience that you've been able to identify coordinators practice?
Yeah, and I had to really train myself in the beginning because coming from Chicago, that this role was referred to as a resource coordinator, and I kept using that language, and I had to catch myself. And I'm really glad that I eventually relearned, to say the coordinator, because that emphasis on resource coordinator really underestimates all of these other important ways that a coordinator is contributing in the school. As a researcher and somebody who really values the importance of data, that was one particular area that I was not fully aware of the important role that a coordinator is playing in the school, of being a broker for data, with that council that I mentioned, that council would have questions about, well, what does the school most need, or what's happening with students in this area, and the coordinator, in collaboration with that community school council, would devise ways to go either collect new data, to go find data that existed, to be able to bring that data to help them make decisions about what that school needs most. And that was one important area that I was not fully aware of what it looked like, in a community school today.
So the practices could be scaled.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual ROI will look different based upon all these different variables you've been talking about.
Right. I do find that this study helped us to lay out this framework of what to look for if you're doing an ROI. It laid out the multiple, so it wasn't such a narrow look at what a coordinator does. It was a broader look, and that framework can provide us with a way forward to collect more data to understand, what does an ROI look like for a coordinator more broadly, other schools, other communities.
Okay. We're getting a couple practice questions in here, so I want to address a couple of those quickly because, and keep the focus on the ROI itself, but I do want to address some of them because some of them are pretty relevant here. Like Andrew, you're asking about how are the reading level impact being measured. There's a number of different ways. I will say in general that Manzano Mesa Elementary was seen as an anomaly in the state based upon the demographics of their school. One particular program, I can't quote the exact numbers, but it was a actual program that was borrowed from Cincinnati that we had learned from the 2014 national conference, and they implemented, and at Manzano Mesa was the first school in Albuquerque to implement that, and it outperformed anything that the district had been paying for in regards to reading levels, to the point now they're scaling that, and now the district has noticed that, and they were starting to put in practices across the district. So that's, I didn't give you the exact numbers because I don't know them, but that wasn't Michelle's focus either, but I just wanted to answer that. Another question I had about, Catherine was asking about, if you're seeking funding, could a study like this be misinterpreted, like doing so much with so little? No, I think this is quite the opposite, Catherine, about how effective and efficient even current public dollars could be used. The fundraising piece that was used in this was also across community schools, is that when most people operate from a scarcity and deficit, this is about the assets of all the communities. The cost is going to depend on how you do community school. But I think the value, and I think what everybody agrees, whether you're a grassroots organizer, a union, a university, a United Way, another nonprofit doing community school work, the value in this position, a community school coordinator. There are different ways people do that, and people have different strengths of how they enter the work, but this study can show the value of that position itself. And you can always build on, this is how else that we can add and contribute to, but it's a great starting point.
Yeah, and I do think that that's part of what realizing that this is a place for us to start, but we definitely would like to include, to do more ROIs, to really be able to broaden this and understand what it looks like with established coordinators, where the cost is perhaps more than what in this particular example, but what do those returns look like? And I would not, I think everything that we saw in this is that it's especially as you refine the way that you set those boundaries, that I think that we're going to be, I think it's important for us to look at. Yeah.
Yeah. Quick hats off. I did want to mention Michelle has shown and talked about earlier the stages of development. Well, we have the godmother on, Jane, I'll never make that mistake again. We have the godmother on the phone with us here too. A lot of the work that the National Center for Community Schools, I think one of the things that the National Center, as one of the founders of the Coalition for Community Schools, added was these stages of development. And then also with the work of National Centers and the Children's Aid staff and team led by Jane Quinn at the time, contributed largely to the development of the community school standards also. So I just wanted to recognize that. And
I just know that in Albuquerque that work was essential and fundamental in those early stages, as Albuquerque figured out what does this mean and what does it look like and how do we do it, that all of those, and we benefited a lot from Jane's technical assistance in those days.
And hats off to my predecessors too, Marty and Reuben, as well as how they work together to codify some of these best practices with local folks.
Definitely.
Real quick on Kim, the question you have here, how are you able to determine what partners will be necessary to meet students' needs, and the needs assessment question done. So how the coordinators were trained and developed, I mentioned earlier that Michelle had trained us on results-based accountability, and we practiced that a lot. So it was, and this also kind of answers Jane's question as far as the differences in ROI per year, because sometimes when programs are implemented to mitigate and manage things that aren't working well, so partners were brought to the table based off of communication and conversations with parents. Michelle also mentioned that who sat at that table, right? That parents were part of those people. So Deanna was a parent at one point, so the school was already practicing community school practices, but Deanna helps escalate them to a degree that now the school, it just becomes part of their culture. So part of the purpose also from community schools, I know at least in Albuquerque since I was there, 100%. Michelle told you before you get to know me, 100% is always the goal. But we do have time frames. So that team would also try to engage 100% of parents who were having ill effects or injustices or things that they were, whether it be intentional or unintentional, being oppressed from. The goal was to go engage 100% of them. But don't let that hold you up if you don't get 100% from doing some good right now, because this is a continuous improvement strategy. So the partners varied based upon what the aspirations were of young people and their families, and the barriers they were facing from achieving that.
Yeah, and I think that it was, as Jose just described, that there was the seeking out of new partners based on the needs that were found from surveying or convening families. But there was also an aspect of the existing partners shifting what they were contributing to the school. And so working with existing partners for them to shift their work to have it map onto and align to what the families and students were needing.
Yeah. Robin, how you doing? Robin Hickey. Question, is the community school coordinator's call to choose, for example, between academic enrichment and social behavioral well-being? Well, we all know community schools address the whole child needs right here. So it was the community school coordinators and the community school council's job to be responsive to parents and young people, whatever that called for. That's the short answer of it. But whatever that called for. So in that, one of the things that, going back to Andrew also, two programmatic highlights that are in the study, once you see the full thing, are, one is Homework Diner, which some have come to know. That was actually borrowed also in a spin-off of something we learned in Cincinnati as well too. But that Deanna brought that back, and another parent who came with us to Cincinnati during a national conference brought that back, and they just kept using continuous improvement cycles to build upon it. And now that from social media, this is not a survey or anything like that, homework diners are being implemented in at least 17 other states. So the impact that teachers report on the level of engagement they have and relationship, the depth of relationship they have with families has grown exponentially, but so has the outcomes that the outward world looks at in regards to student achievement as well too. Another thing that brought out this type of collaboration and engagement is, Michelle talked about preschool co-op. So that's mentioned in the study as well, worth looking up as well too, where moms were supported by the coordinator in that school to develop their own, I'm giving it the real short story, develop their own preschool as a cooperative. That council work was aided by a number of organizations, including the community college and the university, and to actually fund them getting accredited or certified in early childhood. In early childhood, and this is their second year of actually running a preschool co-op business inside of a community school. That's a whole other story right there.
It is a whole other story, and it's an exciting story. And I'll just mention that in the report, we take that story about the preschool co-op and we overlay those stages of development / standards for a coordinator. And so there's a page or a couple of pages in the report that do kind of show how those stages and standards kind of show up.
Yeah. So Angelina, I love your question. Were the people in their site team paid stipends? No, heck, we didn't barely have any money to pay the coordinator. That's where we started the whole study. So, even community school work is the will of the willing. Who is willing to make a difference? Who's willing to be part of this change? And I know Deanna and all the coordinators over there in Albuquerque and other coordinators I get a chance to come across, do a great job of engaging people in the conversation. And folks have the ability to choose to contribute to that or not. So community schools is more about the contributions people make and not so much the attributions back to themselves. That's why it worked out so well. What other question do we have here? Are you seeking to replicate this study in other areas? So yeah, we have gone into some discussions. If people are interested in doing that, I'm sure Michelle will be interested in doing that with you as well. We'll give you contact information as well. But we are looking through ways of how every community school coordinator be able to, one, just record the historical practices of collaboration that they're having. That's really what this does, right? When you hear about Deanna's ability to keep everything, I hired Deanna later on in administration for ABC, but she keeps everything. But this is a way also where, as a community school, can document the history of collaboration and to what purpose it goes to. So we're looking at exploring how we can scale this across the country right now. Other questions other folks may have? I may be missing one here. So would you recommend this type of evaluation be done on an annual basis for the benefit of a district and stakeholders and individual schools? Michelle, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, that we had different ideas about multiple ways that this could be used. I mean, that certainly in advocacy and policy work, but as a professional development tool, as a way of understanding how a school and a coordinator's growth is happening over time, to understand. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential to be able to do this when done ideally each year, because I do think there's a lot of difference each year. And so it doesn't mean that just because the number were to go up or down slightly between years, I think there's a lot to learn about what's happening from the numbers that go into the ROI calculation. And I think there's an application at an individual school level and the learning that happens as well as at a system level when you roll that information up.
Yeah, from the system level, I'll speak from the system level perspective. It's extremely important. So just the makeup of our board back in Albuquerque, there you had 3 local government agencies come into a joint power of agreement. So providing them that value back, especially utilizing taxpayer dollars for a venture and a strategy such as community schools was not only important for them to make decisions, but it was also important to be transparent what we're doing with those dollars as well too, and what the added benefit is back to the local community. So I would encourage doing something like this on an annual basis. Also from the systems piece, there are decisions that, from us who are not doing community school coordinating work and not at the school, that some of these practices we can learn from of what is working well, what is working, what can we improve upon across larger systems. That some of these if we had the numbers more readily available, we can make some decisions to even provide support and re-guide systemic national partnerships across an entire district, city, or county as well. And then to leverage, the final thing is to actually leverage that per area, and going to develop some additional resources. What I do know that there are nonprofits, YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, other nonprofits, I'm thinking of YDI, Youth Development Incorporated, who began to change their practices in collaboration because of these practices that they've had. That looks like the questions that we have for today. Oh, one last question. What am I missing? How long does it take? Oh, there we go. How long does it take to perform one of these evaluations? Michelle, that's for you.
Well, I think this one took a little bit longer than I think future ones would, in the fact that we had to create kind of the methodology and everything else.
Longer than I wanted because I was gone.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that, and it's also really dependent on whether you're using data that's already collected or going forward. And yeah, but you wanting that to be?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and so Sorry, we're just doing two different things. So in this particular study, it took about, the actual doing of all the study was about a year and a half. But I think that is largely due to us having to figure everything out for the first time.
Yeah. So we'll be sharing things. We'll be building out tools. I see that as well too. But I do want to thank you, Michelle, a good close friend here, and glad to see you here. She's right here in Washington, D.C. I want to thank Emily for actually putting together the webinar for us and calling you all here tomorrow. Actually, today, this week is Coordinators Appreciation Week, so please do something to recognize the coordinators in your area across the country, whether it be through social media. Do something special for them. They're the unsung heroes of our movement. They're the movement builders for us as a coalition. Tomorrow, we'll be having a number of people here going on the Hill and talking to their members of Congress, using this study as a tool to engage them with. But also, Michelle will be doing a presentation again at a Hill briefing from 2 o'clock to 3:30 at the Senate Visitor Center in rooms 210 and 212. Anybody who's in the D.C. area, more than welcome to come by and have a good time with us. And tonight, I would say also, there'll be a little mini reception of those who are in town, just to get together and get to know each other. So again, once again, I want to thank you all for participating and joining us and asking some great questions. Look forward to the next Research Practice Network, and stay tuned of how this tool will be rolled out across our country.